Hey, small group leaders. Welcome to a coaching video for session 2 in exploreGOD. Again, the purpose of these coaching videos is simply to highlight a couple of things in your conversation that you just want to be prepared for, as well as, again, to point you to some helpful resources to help you navigate the discussion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about session 2 specifically, but then I also want to point you to a couple of other things that are going to help you with this session. The central question in session 2 is there a God? And really the reason why this question is so important is because how you answer that question does have implications for how you live. If there is no God, it means that life is pretty meaningless, that we have no basis for assuming that we as a species are unique or have any sort of purpose or telos. If God doesn't exist, we have no basis for appealing to things like morality beyond simply what we can enforce by might. Might makes right. But if there is a God, then the question becomes, well, what is God like, and what does it mean to, how do we know, and what's his character? Are we supposed to have a relationship with him? It kind of opens up all these other questions. And so that's why I think it's appropriate that this question now comes in week 2 of the series, is really that question of, does life have a purpose or not? And this question of, is there a God? They go hand in hand. They're really a part of that same kind of wrestling. And it's important to keep that in mind. So a couple of things just to help you navigate this discussion. First and foremost, this is a good tip for all of these sessions. I would start your discussion simply by asking the question to your group, why does this question matter to you? What are you hoping to wrestle with as we look at this question? Now, you can do that either before or after the Pulse of the World video. It's up to you. But the whole idea of that Pulse of the World video, that very first like 2.5-minute video that you watch, is it's people kind of sounding off on the question. And you want your own group to be engaging with that question personally as well. So by you asking the question, why does this question matter to you? How might you answer it? Was there any viewpoint within that Pulse of the World video that really resonated with you? Why? Is there any viewpoint in that video that you disagreed with, and why? I mean, these are really important. This is really a great launching point for any of your discussions, is that interplay between that Pulse of the World video and the question as it relates to the people in your group. So you may just want to ask that question and say, why does this question matter to you? I mean, you're here, you're part of this discussion group. What is it about this question that either connects or doesn't connect? Why, how are you wrestling with it? What are you thinking about? So that's an important kind of piece to this session. And so you've got a couple discussion questions here to follow up the Pulse of the World. And I already kind of mentioned one. Do you identify with anyone's expressed views in the film? The second question, to what do you attribute the 11% decline in belief in God over the past 20 years? Can be kind of interesting, but can also be an intellectual question. So again, you want to make it kind of personal. The question is, to what do you attribute the 11% decline? If people say something like, well, the rise in science and evolutionary theory, I would follow that up and say, do you find that to be proof for or against God? Why or why not? Again, the point of all these discussions is to really help your group process where they are at personally. So don't just leave it at the intellectual hypotheticals. Really drill down and try to think about, how can I help my group engage with this question in a personal way? After that, you're going to go ahead and watch the longer video, the Curiosity Collective video. A couple questions in here that I think are really, really good questions and definitely worth asking is certainly the first one, do you personally identify with any of the stories in the Curiosity Collective? What did you find intriguing or compelling? Also, again, it's just helping them personally engage. I love the second question as well. What makes it easy to believe in God? What makes it hard, and why? Really helping them wrestle with that. And then there's some of these other questions really have to relate to the different kinds of proofs or evidence that the various people in the video talked about. Question 4, Andy Crouch shares that he's convinced God exists because of the cosmological constants and their impact on life. There's others, though, who talk about the sense of beauty and wonder and awe that we instinctually feel seems to point us to something higher than ourselves. The other one that they talk about is, this idea of justice and morality points to a divine lawgiver. The reason why those videos, why they have people sounding off on those points of evidence is because those are actually evidences that many Christians and many philosophers have pointed to for the existence of God. So I think starting to explore that with your group a little bit and saying, which of those stories did you resonate with? Why did you resonate with it? What makes you feel that is evidence pointing toward the existence of a God? What makes you maybe think that argument isn't legitimate? Really start just mining that, starting to talk a little bit about that, I think is really, really important and something really worth helping your group wrestle with. And I love the last question asked. Do you think, what do you think could convince you to change your current stance on God's existence, be that belief or unbelief, is a really, really good question for anybody to process and seriously think through, especially if people in your group are wrestling with faith in God. But even for the people who are convinced, it's a good question to really think about. What brought you to a place of being convinced? And is there anything that wouldn't convince you, that would somehow change your mind? Again, the reason why is hopefully we're teasing out that we actually do have reasons to believe. And so I think that's important to highlight and to note for your group. This is a conversation that I think really gets the ball moving when it comes to evidence. People start to really wrestle with, well, is there any scientific proof, or is there any scientific evidence? Is there any moral or philosophical evidence? And for that reason, I really, really would recommend that you send them the resources post your group discussion, especially finding a couple of titles or books that speak to this. The Reason for God by Timothy Keller is actually a phenomenal book, and there's a little link in those resources that you can send to your group if they really want to pick up that book, because Timothy Keller kind of engages these various arguments and tries to make a strong case for them. So I think that, again, this is just a really important topic to discuss. But I also want to highlight a couple other things that I think are going to help you with this discussion. First and foremost, you will notice in your resources tab on your group page that there is a document that you can download called Asking the Right Questions. And within that document, it has several follow-up questions that you could ask about several follow-up questions that you could ask that directly relate to this topic. So if you have not downloaded that and taken a look at that, I would start to get familiar with some of those questions. These were questions that this was a handout we actually gave at our last small group leaders training. It's gonna be very, very helpful for you as you think about how can I really go deeper with this particular topic. The other thing that is going to be really important, I think, for helping your group with this, and a resource you might want to lean into, is actually the sermons that are going to be preached in week 2 of this series, which is coming up this weekend pretty fast on the 20th. I recognize some of you might meet before that sermon is actually preached, so you may want to send the sermon out afterwards once it's posted as a podcast. But I want to give you a preview, if you haven't, if you're leading a group before we preach on that topic, by giving you a little glimpse at my sermon in advance, just to kind of give you some food for thought as you're helping your group wrestle with this. Really, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the various evidences or things that I think point us toward the existence of God. The first one is the moral evidence. This idea that within the human heart, there is this instinct which seems to understand there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong. C.S. Lewis actually opens Mere Christianity with a great quote about this. He says, "Everyone has heard people quarreling, and I believe that we can learn something very important from listening to the kinds of things they say. And what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He's appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other person to know about." So when we hear people arguing and say, "Hey, that's not fair," or "I was sitting there first," or, kids like, "Well, I share this with you, you should share it with me." They're appealing to some sort of moral standard that we're all supposed to know about. And what's interesting is many people have tried to argue that those morals are culturally conditioned. But even if you study the field of anthropology, some really fascinating things tend to come out. there was once an ethnography published in which this particular anthropologist was studying a tribe that was very, very warlike and seemed to basically say that deceit was okay for the purpose of getting what you wanted. And so he did this whole ethnography to show that, you know, they didn't seem to have a problem with war. They didn't seem to have a problem with lying. And that just shows that morals are culturally conditioned. But what was fascinating is other ethnographers then visited that tribe, and what they said is, they said, yes, this tribe does have lots of warfare, and there is kind of a culture of lying, especially to their enemies. But what's interesting is when you ask them how they feel about it when someone does it to them. One of the ethnographers said, so when another tribe comes against you and they steal, you know, your women and children, or they lie to you, what do you think about that? And they say, well, we don't like it. And then he said, well, why? Is it because you just got outsmarted at your own game? And they said, well, no, because it's wrong to kill people. It's wrong to lie to people. So even though they recognize that, like, even though they engage in warfare and in deceit, there's something within them that recognizes that that is wrong. And the only reason we're doing it is to survive. You see, that's what we're talking about with moral evidence. Moral evidence, this moral impulse within human nature, is really the basis of societies and governments. It's the basis of things like civil rights and social justice. And so I think it's really, really important to know that the moral evidence is one of those things that points us toward the existence of God. Other bit of evidence is called the ontological evidence. This idea that there is something greater out there, something beyond ourselves. Human beings have this natural desire for the unknown. Again, C.S. Lewis, great quote. He says, basically, if we experience a feeling of thirst, it must mean that there is water which can satisfy it. If we experience this feeling of hunger, it means that there is such a thing as food which nourishes us. And so if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, then the most probable explanation is that we are made for another world. That's what we're talking about, the ontological evidence. There's something within our being that says we are meant for more. And oftentimes we try to satisfy that urge with things that are less, like our jobs, our careers, and our relationships, but we still have this hunger within our hearts that points us to the fact that we are intended for more. St. Augustine said it this way. He said, our hearts are restless, Lord, until they find our rest in thee. And that's what we're talking about, the ontological evidence. It points us to the fact that God is loving. He desires to have a relationship with us and to satisfy our deepest needs. Third kind of evidence is the scientific evidence. This is something that's already talked about in the video, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. But it is fascinating that scientists within the scientific community are increasingly pointing to the fact that the universe seems to be fine-tuned and put together by some sort of intelligent designer. And I'm not talking about Christian scientists. I'm talking actually about scientists that don't have a faith background. Guys like Robert Jastrow, who is actually the first chairman of NASA's Lunar Exploration Committee, actually said that you can't look at the universe and come to the conclusion that it all happened by random chance. There's a good quote here, which I'll be using this weekend. Likewise, Paul Davies did not start from a place of faith. He ended up arriving at a place of faith as he, a physicist, really studied our universe and kind of came to this conclusion. Likewise, when you look at like evolution and evolutionary theory, what we start to see is that this idea that we just randomly emerged from like the primordial soup, increasingly paleontologists and people who look at the fossil record are saying that just doesn't seem to be possible without some sort of intelligent designer being involved in our creation. And so that's why we point to the scientific evidence. Scientific evidence tells us that God is both creative and powerful, and that he's carefully designed all of life according to a predetermined plan. Another kind of evidence, and we're really going to get into this later in the series, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, is the historical evidence. The fact that when you look at the Bible compared to all other historical documents, it thoroughly stands up to the test of scrutiny, that we have far more ancient copies of the Bible, and that the Bible was put together in a far shorter time than any other reliable ancient historical manuscript. Points us to the fact that God is actually active and makes himself known in human history. The whole point being that we have lots of reasons to believe, and for people who are struggling with that, you may want to send them the podcast of the sermon where we're really going to be talking about that in some greater detail. So I hope that helps you get ready. So that's just a couple tips for Is There a God? Remember, this is really a discussion This isn't so much a teaching time. You really want to know where your group is at and just be asking questions to help them dive in and really see why this question matters and to really start to think it through and give them further tools for further discovery. So I hope that helps you as you get ready a little bit. Please watch the videos in advance. Please come up with your own follow-up questions. Please take a look at some of the resources even as you prepare. I think that's really going to serve you well as you get ready to lead your group. So again, I hope this was helpful. As always, you can reach out to me if you've got any questions. May God bless you as you're continuing to lead people through these discussions. Take care.